the Farmland Exchange, the official podcast of CLHbid.com. Expert insights on buying and selling farmland in Western Canada.
Welcome back to the Farmland Exchange Podcast. I'm Devon Davidson, your host and digital media strategist for CLHbid.com. Today we're talking about how CLHbid.com is the perfect fit for selling estate land. We're going to dive into the complexities of selling estate land and how CLHbid, our unique approach, provides clarity, certainty, and maximum value for beneficiaries and executors. And here to have the conversation, Alle Carter, CEO of CLHbid.com, and Alle Carter, legal and member of the executive team. How you guys doing?
Great. Thanks, Devon.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Okay, so lots to talk about here. I think the first topic we wanted to cover was set exit dates for distribution. So, Roy, setting a firm exit date for the sale of estate land seems to offer a lot of clarity for beneficiaries. Can you just explain a little bit about how that approach simplifies the distribution process?
Sure, Devon. With CLHbid, we're a law firm. We're escalating tender. The sale's one day. We have world-class marketing in advance of that. Everybody's aware of the sale. From our point of view, everything's locked down because we're a law firm. We have our own programmers in-house. Everybody's in-house. No bidders' names are ever disclosed. But price is flushed out on one day. It allows the estate to plan for distribution of the estate, to make tax planning in advance. They know the set date, and basically for the executor to deal with beneficiaries and said, basically, this is the day we're going to the curb. It relieves the executor of the unknown and ongoing hold of property of getting offers that are conditional, that have so-called outs that fall through. And, an executor, there's an onus on the executor to dispose of the assets for the maximum value in a timely basis. And they don't end up in a long hold period hoping for an offer and, maybe the economy goes south or something happens in a world event and that type of deal.
Alle, anything to add to that?
Just kind of broadly speaking, I guess being an executor can feel like quite a cumbersome task. You have a fiduciary duty that you owe to the beneficiaries to get maximum, fair market value for the asset that you're selling. And in this case, we're talking about farmland. And as Roy mentioned, in a timely manner. And so that can be, typically the land is sometimes the largest asset that deceased would have had. And so it's something that everyone has an opinion about, whether you're talking to one beneficiary, whether you're talking to 18. And so the executor can be tasked with answering to a lot of different people with a lot of different questions. And if that isn't dealt with in a timely manner, if it's dragged out, kind of maybe we'll talk about a little later, if it's listed and, as Roy mentioned, with conditional offers, it's then taken off the market for an extended period of time. You're dragging this estate out, and these beneficiaries aren't necessarily going to be happy with waiting for their inheritance for sometimes years. And then obviously still answering to the beneficiaries at the end of the day, and how do you prove to them that that's what you got was fair market value? Right. But I think we'll go into a little bit later on about list price as well. And
for sure. Yeah, we will. Then there's no conditions. And Roy, we talked about this, providing certainty. And so how does that really, having a condition-free sale, what is so valuable about that for executors and for beneficiaries alike?
Again, we're not realtors or auctioneers. We're a law firm. With tender, you give your client more control. It's, unreserved auction. It's going down the chute that day. List, you let the purchaser drive the bus. They make the offers. They decide what they want to cherry pick out of the farm. If it's an estate sale, they basically want everything sold. It'll generally sell as a lift, all the pieces if sold together. You don't want to be left with one rubber boot. So I would say the biggest deal by legal tender, which we are, legal escalating tender, we give a lot more control to our client. And our client quite often is a client of another law firm. We sell farms across Western Canada. We like relationships. We respect relationships. Often the estate has virtually 99% of the time they have an estate lawyer and a tax advisor. We work with them to basically, allow the managed letdown and giving the estate, a lot more control, right?
Mm-hmm. And Alle, from your perspective, are there any legal challenges when there are conditional estate sales, and how does that impact the executors?
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of as I mentioned before, it is kind of a cumbersome onus that is on the executor, and then you're potentially, accepting one offer if it has conditions, as we mentioned quite thoroughly in our podcast with Henry about how we're different from realtors. It's basically an opt-out clause, so the purchaser can say, well, my offer is conditional on getting financing, and then the property is taken off the market for that time. Even if a better offer comes in, the executor can't accept it.
Right.
And like potentially a cash offer, for example, that is a lot more appealing. Mm-hmm. And then maybe financing doesn't come through, or they are really opt-out clauses. So maybe they use their money elsewhere, got scared commodity prices are coming down. Now you've taken the property off the market, and maybe now, as I mentioned, if commodity prices are on the down, you've missed that ideal time to sell.
Right.
So you're really dragging out the distribution of the estate and potentially selling it at a less than optimal time, which will adversely affect the value of the land. So just having a set exit date, even with our platform, we look at when the best time would be to sell. And usually if it's, for example, in the summer, we like July, no one's really, people are usually pretty optimistic about their crops still. Mm-hmm. They think that their bins are going to be quite full. And so we are strategic about when we sell, and we always try to maximize value for the client that way.
Okay. The next topic we wanted to cover was sort of using the best option for the estate sale. And so I think one comparison you guys made was getting the right doctor for mom, right? Not the one with the wrong tools. Alle, maybe just explain to us the potential downsides of sticking with a familiar service or agent that may lack those expertise. Like, what are some of the downsides of that?
Yeah. We always say that we don't know everything. Know what you don't know is sometimes your biggest strength. And we do know how to maximize value with farmland. But we, as Roy mentioned, also really do value that the deceased likely had strong relations with their accountant, potentially their existing law firm. And so that's where we don't want to ever take over from those. We will work closely with those advisors, but it's about, we've lived this space. It's all we do. And so we know the pitfalls. We know what to look for. Has the cost base been bumped on the terminal return, like we'll talk about later? And these are all things that if you have the right team, you can make sure that the job is done properly. And it's not that, we know more. It's just we know this space really well, and we'll bring to light some considerations that can easily get overlooked, because maybe they're experts in other areas.
For sure. Roy, do you have any examples you could share of where they've maybe engaged a family friend to sell an estate sale and things were negatively impacted and maybe how CLH had helped?
Yeah, I mean, definitely we've taken property that's been listed and not sold on an estate and sold it for more than it's been listed for. We've taken land that was subject to a one tender in an envelope to a law firm and then sold it, opened up the marketing, and maximized value that way. We're sort of talking, when we talk estates, we're really talking a couple different events. One is generally mom, is around, and it seems like on the farm, even in my own case. My dad passed away long before my mom. So it's the widow often, not always, but so it's an estate from that point of view, in that the husband might have died. It might be the other way around. Mm-hmm. But, then how to, in her situation, Edith is 84, often a good relationship with a tenant. Often the land's been rented out. And there's a good relationship there, and they just have a hard time. The farm is like another person too, right? Mm-hmm. They've lost their husband. They've got kids in the city maybe, and they've still got the farm, which is just like another person.
That's right.
But, you know, they have a hard time at the table when the tenant says, you know, here's what your land's worth, I want to buy it, right? Mm-hmm. They have a hard time saying, I don't know what it's worth, but, you know, they're thinking to themselves, it's our land, and I got to make sure I look after my kids too. And it allows, a CLHbid allows her to say, you've been awesome. You know, I don't know what it's worth, so I'm going to put it on CLHbid. Mm-hmm. I hope you get it, and you won't overpay, because on CLHbid, that tenant only pays one click more. They don't leave money on the table, right?
Yeah.
So that's the one situation. And in that case, often we're dealing with her estate lawyer. And, you know, from that point of view, like Alle talked about, we often deal with the estate accountant as well, mm-hmm. just to make sure on the terminal return, dad who passed away, they took advantage of his 1.25 to bump the cost base, the ACB. Mm-hmm. So that's the one case. The other case we run into quite a bit is mom and dad are gone. It's the last one has passed away. And that's really quite a different animal. You end up with, you know, often 3 or 4 or 5 kids that have been removed from that farm for decades.
Right.
And, you know, one thing we do is, one thing about an estate, there's often a contract in regards to that land that you don't run into with an active farmer, of course, right? Mm-hmm. So the first thing is we respect, again, relationships. These tenants have huge input costs, you know, and we want to make sure they're respected as well. So the first question asked is, you know, is it under lease? And that doesn't matter whether it's oral or written, you know. Your word needs to be as good as writing, right? So, you know, well, often that's the initial question. We got to respect the existing tenancy. You know, they've obviously based inputs upon a certain term, right? Mm-hmm. So we'll get, you know, we get there. If we go to the group of kids in the city, you know, that's a tough one, in that they're really removed and they pretty much aren't in tune with values, and they've got old relationships from high school and that. Some are maybe realtors, whatever, and they all like to respect those relationships. Mm-hmm. Some are neighboring farmers, but it's almost like, you know, we did a previous podcast about appraisals and values.
Yeah.
Appraisals can be, it's a wild guess in the case of farmland because of so many external factors that can affect it. So, you know, maybe they've even got an appraisal for the estate. But that sometimes can give them bad information too. So we work with them there. But I almost, you know, I look at it almost like, you know, mom and dad pass away, and it's not like opening up the storage unit and there's X cash and X kind of vehicle to liquidate. It's almost more like art. Mm-hmm. It's like, oh yeah, man, they have no idea what it's worth. And with art, you could either take it down to the corner, you know, antique store, mm-hmm. take it to the local auctioneer, you know, or maybe take it to an online art sales place, right? Yeah. What might get you the more money? Maybe somebody that lives art and does that space, right? Does that make sense?
Totally. Yeah.
And, you know, going back to you and the doctor with mom, mm-hmm. I guess it would be the same analogy. You know, if the kids are talking to mom, you know, she's probably got a good relationship with her doctor, the, you know, general practitioner or whatever. But if her heart's bad, you know, she's probably better off letting him operate, the guy that she doesn't really know, but that's what he does, mm-hmm. than, you know, Joe, that's her GP, probably keep him away from heart surgery, right? Yeah. So hopefully that makes some sense there. You know, you need the right team, but you also need the right platform. Mm-hmm. If you want to discover the true price of that art or land, you know, the platform is critical. And we've talked about this before. Listing it doesn't work. Right. There's no price discovery. Nobody trusts it. They wait for it to drop. Mm-hmm. You know, tendering to a lawyer does not work, or we would have never started CLHbid. It would have been much cheaper just to do tender. Mm-hmm. You know, we saw the wrecks with tender, the money left on the table, the shopping. people tendering $1 over the highest tender. It's I had a fellow tell me one time that they buy a lot of land by tender, but he never tenders. And he was kind of saying, you've heard all the tender stories, Roy. And I said, I think so. And he said, well, I got one for you. And it was like, so he said, yeah, we buy a lot of land by tender, but we never tender. And I was like, yeah, I never heard that story before. And then he proceeded to tell me that, yeah, they'll drop off letters at the law firm advertising the land for sale with $1,000 or $10,000, depends upon the amount. In this case, it was $10,000. They'll drop off $10,000 in an envelope if they're invited to the tender opening at that law firm and allowed to cherry pick.
Wow.
And it's like, that's crazy. So I guess, if you go down the list, we know Alle was talking about, if you start accepting offers for part of it, you can really kill yourself if you piecemeal it. You lose the whole assemblage.
Yeah.
There's auction. We know unreserved doesn't work on piecemealing. It's way too risky. And, should an executor be liquidating property by unreserved sale? You're open to collusion, et cetera. I think it's way too risky.
For sure.
Sort of jumping around a bit, but definitely, basically, we look at the situation, whether it's just mom left or the kids. Mom usually will have a better idea of what's going on in the community and values because her and her husband have been talking all the time. The kids is a different story. It's like we work with them and hopefully show them where the landmines are. And the whole goal, again, is to maximize value and not take over from their estate lawyer. We definitely get referrals from law firms across Western Canada that say, you guys do this. It makes more sense than tender, take it on, right? Yeah.
And I would say just because each sale and family dynamic and situation is so unique, it really takes a team to drill down into what their situation is in order to maximize value. And I often have individuals coming up to me at trade shows or, and say, how much do you charge? And I always think that their question first should be, what can you do for me that's different than everyone else? Totally. And we are just a completely different animal in that we will drill down into things that they don't even know are concerns, nor would they ever know that those are concerns if there's not a team of experts that bring it to their attention and then guide them into how to manage that. We don't just say that all of these are issues and then you're on your own. We walk the entire walk with them.
Yeah.
From the first Zoom phone call with everyone, the marketing, the land transfers, direct depositing money to usually their estate lawyers, trust account.
Just to that point, Alle, what are some of the details that CLH really drills down into because as an executor or beneficiary, maybe you're just, as you said, you're not in tune with what's going on. So what sort of things does CLH look for in terms of avoiding the landmines and to making sure that we're maximizing value and that the beneficiaries are retaining more of those proceeds?
I would say one of the biggest ones that we, first look at is how is the land being held? Were kids added on title for estate planning purposes? Has the deceased claimed their, complete capital gains exemption? How much is left over? All of those are huge aspects. And oftentimes, even if the kids are holding some of the land, it's the kind of common idea is that, I can't qualify, I don't have my capital gains exemption because maybe I wasn't actively farming it.
Right.
Or there's issues where, maybe it's transferred kind of sideways, and Roy will talk more on this after, but transferred sideways from, daughter to her sister. And that all changes the dynamic so much. And so there's quite a few tax considerations that we like to really look at the forefront.
Yeah, I'll go back to tax. Definitely when you talk about maximizing, packaging is absolutely huge. Estates used to be sold as 8 quarters. Tom Edgar passed away and he had 8 quarters. And they have a buyer for the 8 quarters. Well, again, that's not the way to maximize value. We ask for tenders on halves or quarters, and then we have our on block at the end to maximize values from that point of view. Going back to Alle's tax, Often the beneficiaries are in a different tax positions. From that point of view, there might be one living in Norway, one living in the United States. They're not entitled to their capital gains exemption. Other ones are. Often they have, coffee talk tax advice. It's like, you didn't crop share, or you've been gone too far from Vermilion, too long from Vermilion, you're not eligible.
Yeah.
Most of that is not accurate, and they're eligible a lot more often than they think they are. And then, like Alle said, there will be times where, you got to look at why they're on title. If they were on title, which is pretty common these days for estate planning only, definitely that's a different category than if there's been a disposition and the rollover's been taken into account and they're on title for that reason. So there's basically, it's just sort of going down know what you don't know, going down the checklist, and we sort of alert them to the issues, and then generally they deal with their accountant and lawyer, and often we communicate together, kind of thing, to maximize value for them.
Have you seen situations where the collaboration between the estate lawyer and the accountant hasn't gone smoothly, or there's not that communication there? Like, how has that impacted estate sales and negatively impacted maybe the beneficiaries?
I think but good question. I think if we had the approach that we were know-it-alls and this territorial deal where we want these clients, it wouldn't go well. But we've grown up in a farm community, rural community. We respect relationships, and if we've got something to add, we obviously wouldn't be growing across Western Canada if we didn't have something to add. So we're not trying to usurp the function of the people they have, and I think people get that. They're not threatened by us. We definitely have tax advisors behind us. We're lucky enough, our COO, Bridget Henniger, who leads that, probably has got a nicer personality than you or I. And people like her. And whether it be the other accountant or other lawyer. And they're not threatened by it. And most advisors are genuinely interested in doing what's right for the client. It's not... I want to look like I'm the know-it-all. We'll get that sometimes, but it's pretty rare where you get the feeling that, this person doesn't want their client talking to anybody else.
Right.
I would say that's really rare. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I would also say that there are circumstances where, maybe both advisors aren't aware of what the other is doing. But a lot of times too, it might come upon the accountant, for example, as a surprise that, the land's being sold next week type thing. That allows for zero planning at that point. It's like, I wish I would have known about this months ago.
Have you seen something like that happen?
Yeah, quite often. I would say on our platform, we take enough time to really drill down and so that, doesn't happen, and so that we have all the advisors on board and can wait to have a sale for a couple years.
For sure.
For example, that last one that we had a couple months ago, we had to wait so that they could maximize their after-tax dollars.
Right.
Yeah.
That was the 3-year hold period where kids have to hold their interest for 3 years before they dispose of it, before they actually market it. Definitely looking at everything like that.
That doesn't apply, obviously, if it's the executor selling the estate land. That was a different situation where kids were actually added on to title.
Okay.
Yeah.
You mentioned, I think both of you mentioned this now, that the beneficiaries are quite often out of touch, or can be, with what's going on in the local market and with land values. So how do you approach that situation? How do you help them understand the value of their land? Is it just an education thing? I mean, are there resources you turn to? How do you approach that?
Yeah, I think the biggest one is honesty and, use examples, explain that nobody really knows the value of that land. There's just the assemblage. We've talked on other podcasts about, we've sold land for over double appraised. And I probably wouldn't have done a better job on the appraisal than what was done. But we don't overpromise and underdeliver. We don't tell people what their land's worth. Because it's worth what the market. The market's smart. It takes everything into account, and most executors, when you talk to them about that, they like that. It takes the pressure off them. They don't have to decide what the price is. They let the market do it. And if they let the market do it, they've done their duty. They've delivered for their beneficiaries. So again, as CLHbid as a law firm, we generally don't deal with the beneficiaries, the group. There's maybe the odd exception where they'd want to be involved or something, but that's totally the executor's call.
Sure, yeah.
So we're generally dealing with one executor. And generally it's a case of they look at our marketing, talk to past executors. We've got numerous executors, if you want to talk to them, that have even in some cases tried selling other ways and it didn't work and they came to us. So, if they wanted to, I'd suggest that. But they definitely have to believe in the process, the marketing. But most see it, I drove from Winnipeg to Brandon the other day. I saw your vans along the highway. I see you guys spend money. You're not regional. You can get buyers from a different province. The world has changed, right?
For sure.
We've got a lot of investors that'll buy on our site because, again, like we've talked about before, it's like the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. So all of a sudden you got a solid floor, broad-based buyers, world-class marketing, and true price discovery. And that executor can basically, a lot of pressure's off and they can take it easy and say they maximize value. Yeah.
I think the biggest thing at the end of the day is that we do alleviate a lot of that pressure off of the executor and that they don't have the beneficiaries coming to them questioning whether they sold at fair market value and what fair market value is, because we will do anything to ensure that value is maximized by our marketing, absolutely everything, by the packaging, the on block, and we provide them that floor with the starting bid, and so that at the end of the day we have engaged all interested parties, and so it's pretty hard to argue that fair market wasn't achieved. Whereas if you list it, well, how did you decide what price to list it at? You're really capping what you would ever get.
It opens it up for debate with the beneficiaries, right?
Totally. And just much more of a headache and a long process for the executor.
Okay, Roy, you mentioned this earlier. The cost base hasn't been bumped in the terminal return. I think Alle, you and I talked about it earlier too. But Roy, can you maybe just explain the significance of ensuring that the cost base has been bumped properly in the terminal return for estate land, and then how that impacts tax liability for the beneficiaries?
Yeah, every estate has a capital gains exemption to the extent it hasn't been used. That should equate to roughly $300,000. It depends upon the inclusion rate, but there's $300,000 in tax saved by just assuming the value of the property, might be north of 2.5, where it exceeds, mom's exemption as well, or the survivor. So it's big bucks, but there's a tendency on estates just to do the terminal return and sometimes not really drill down.
Okay.
That's a big deal.
And sometimes it's about going back and amending that terminal return if you still can, and saying, hey, let's bump this cost base so that we're paying tax on less of a spread. So kind of explaining, I guess, that it's you pay tax on the spread of what the land was acquired at, maybe 80 years ago, versus what it sold at. And so if you can bump that to
something
totally more relevant on dad's terminal return, then everyone's paying that tax spread on a lot lesser of an increase.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. There's a lot to it, but for sure those are things that we look at is, can we go back and amend this terminal return? What can we do here to make sure that they're receiving the most after-tax dollars?
Is that something that gets overlooked quite often?
Oh yeah, I would say quite often.
Yeah.
We see a lot.
Quite a bit.
And not really pointing the finger at anybody. It's it's not really a mistake. It's just that there's something there you could actually do to be beneficial. And that's all we try and do, is give people more tools. A lot of it's just knowledge. I had one last week. A couple beneficiaries, again, it was mom, the survivor. Mom had dementia and then passed away. And these, just to give you a bit of a story there, I was talking to the son and daughter, and they were telling me, mom got dementia, so we drove back to the farm, and we drove up and down the road. And, I think they were thinking back to maybe 20, 30 years ago when it was hard to lease out. They went into one yard and tried to see somebody to lease, nobody home, drove down, went in another yard, and it was like, man, these people really don't know what's going on out there where, half of Saskatchewan is leased, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so anyway, they were going through that, and they were like, hey, we found this tenant, and he told us he would lease for X, right? And I'm kind of sitting there, and I was like, oh, okay. And then they had an appraisal for the estate. And the appraiser said, well, yeah, your land is not worth what it could be because you signed that lease for a super cheap cash rent. And so they were saying to me, and the son or the guy was not the executor, the lady was. There was 3 or 4 other siblings. And she was just devastated because she signed the lease. Mm-hmm. And she said, I guess I hurt our land sale. And I was like, no, you don't sell land on the income approach. We would not sell that land with that lease in place. Mm-hmm. That's just not true. You got to honor the lease, but in the last year of that lease, we will sell it. And the fact that it's cheap has nothing to do with what you're going to get with it.
Right.
Get for it. And it was like, really? And it was like, yeah, no, what's in that appraisal? That appraiser's done too many shops in town or whatever. Yeah. He's appraised on the income approach, which is not realistic, right? We don't sell land under lease. We'll sell in the last year. Generally, I guess there may be exceptions, but in 9 years of selling real estate across Western Canada, we'll sell during the last term of the lease, which works fine. Buyers like to get on in the fall. Often the buyer is the tenant. There's no spook in the land. So, if the lease is up in the fall, we'll maybe sell in July, respect possessions after the crop's off.
Yeah, and a lot of times too, we had an estate sale per se where the kids, inherited the land and approached us to sell, and we go through all the documents with them and ask them, is it being leased out? Yes. How much longer? It was like 3 more years. And we'll work with them to say, these are the things that you can do in these 3 years. We can't sell it, but we're here for the long haul. Right. We're not just here for an event. We'll walk the whole walk with you and guide you into how best we can approach this in 3 years if there's things we can do in the meantime.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Roy, I guess understanding the history of estate land is like we talked about drilling down, just understanding the history of the land that we're trying to sell here. But how does knowing when and how land was acquired help in crafting the right sales strategy? Does that matter?
It does for, tax, the capital gains rules, with the change in the 80s and that type of deal. There is some change there. As far as when to exit, I guess who knows that story. We do know we don't normally like to sell if we got an option after freeze up because most buyers think they can get a better crop the next year if they're on in the fall. They're not drying the land out. They can put anhydrous on or burn off or whatever. If that answers the question there at all.
I think so, yeah. Alle, anything to add to that?
No, we just, there's, like I said, each farm and situation is really unique, and that's where we work with them to show them. It's all ultimately up to the seller. We're just there to guide them, show them, hey, if you wait to sell, these are some potential risks. If you see, if you want to get it sold right now, we can do that. But again, these are the pros, these are the cons, and then ultimately we act for them. So it's up to them.
Okay. One option we do allow is sometimes you get a situation where, the one brother is farming it and the other siblings are removed, right? Mm-hmm. And, that's a bit of obviously we respect that. But having said that, often the other siblings want to monetize it too, right? Mm-hmm. And, work it out. And if they can't work it out, and come to us, we allow one person to bid. We don't allow the group, to bid back. And we obviously monitor that and would block that. But, it's, they can say to the one brother, we don't know what it's worth. You're not going to overpay again. Hopefully they can work it out and don't need us and he can acquire it. But if they can't, he definitely doesn't overpay. He pays market, right? So we do allow one beneficiary. We don't allow the estate to bid back, of course.
And that's kind of goes to that this is all we do. And as lawyers, I think something that maybe shocked me a little bit getting into this profession is we do kind of take on the role of being a counselor almost, or like a family therapist. and we're quite good at it. And we've, our own family, for example, it's there, you understand that when it comes to selling land, there's huge tension sometimes. Sometimes we have beneficiaries who don't speak. They don't really speak to the executor. It's a really tough situation. And we know how to navigate that really well. We know how to make everyone feel included. Everyone's opinion matters. We're not going to pick sides, but we will help, I guess, guide that dynamic in a way that sometimes people end up talking at the end. We've had that at the end of a sale where it's like, these sisters kind of were able to mend their relationship, and what a beautiful thing, because we were just there to kind of mediate and guide them. Because it is a time when tensions are high, especially with estate land. There's emotions usually that are really heightened.
Totally.
And so there's all these factors that we understand and will help them through that.
Well, that seems like a really nice segue into the next question here, which is maybe clarifying some of the legal complexities when land is held jointly for estate sales. How does that affect the sales process and the process of distribution?
Joint generally is easier. The survivor gets it. So from that point of view, joint is often a lot easier process. So that isn't a problem at all. Tenants in common, of course, if an estate, we do get calls, and the estate will own half an interest in land, we wouldn't sell it. It's like selling one rubber boot. You're not going to get half the value for the quarter. So we never sell any fractional ownership.
Okay. Yeah. So just kind of as a background there, I guess there's two ways.
I was going to ask if you could explain that. Yeah, just for our listeners.
There's two ways that land can be held. So either joint tenants or tenants in common, or obviously solely yourself. But joint tenants is right of survivorship. So if you and I hold land together, Devon, as joint tenants, we own 100% of that land together. If you pass away before me, I am the last one on title. It really doesn't even flow into your estate. It's completely outside. So it's not included in the executor's duties because it just flows straight to me. Tenants in common, if you own 50% and I have 50% as tenant in common, you own 50% of that land, I own 50% of that land, I can pass my 50% on to my kids in my will.
Okay.
It's really messy, and we'll do another podcast on this, because then I could add my kids and you could be on title with these two random kids, for example. And we do, as Roy said, get calls on, I own a percentage as a tenant in common in this land, can you sell it? And it's like, really, your only other buyer is the other person in that land, because no one's wanting to buy into that situation.
No.
Yeah.
No. Okay. We may have covered this, but respecting past relationships and emotional ties. So we talked a little bit about that. But Roy, how do you balance the financial aspects of an estate land sale with emotional connections the beneficiaries might have to the property?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the executor is supposed to park the emotional. They got a duty, fiduciary duty to beneficiaries to maximize. Generally, we get really super good positive feedback from beneficiaries. A big comment is we don't want to prefer, the girl might say, well, I was friends with so-and-so that married so-and-so at Vegreville, and my brother, though, was friends with another farmer in school. And they might get pulled, and then they'll have some cousins involved. And it's like they're pulled between a bunch of people in the community. So they totally like CLHbid, and that basically they're not picking sides. No preferential. They're giving everybody a chance. Because even though they maybe don't see these people once every 3-4 years, or when they go back to their class reunion, they still respect that. And they do like the idea that, even, mom and dad would have liked it, giving everybody a chance, right? So they respect relationships, and they like the way they're not forced to pick somebody over somebody else.
I think, too, we've had quite a few Zoom calls, and they say at the end, I feel more comfortable after this call because it goes hand in hand with our marketing, where we value the family farm. We are all farmers, and we understand what that means. And so sometimes there is a lot of sadness that comes with the sale of especially estate land. It might be the reality that none of the kids wanted or could take it over, and now they're having to sell it, and that doesn't come easy. We get stories where I used to go coyote hunting in this corner, and these are all things that we value. And so in our marketing, we tell that story and kind of give it its last send off. And so we have the script writer go out and write that, and we work with everyone involved that tell us these stories, tell us your favorite parts of the land, that one day you maybe wanted to build a house overlooking that lake or something, and we really try to capture that for the last time for them as well. We truly care.
Yeah, it's really important. And there's lots of great stories that we've had in past podcasts about just that, because in Roy, like you said, it's like losing another person. So there's lots of emotions there, but make sure to check out, I think it's episode 3 where producer Mike and I get into that with Roy. It's a good one. The next topic here, guys, is qualified farm property rules, just kind of clarifying some of that. So Alle, maybe you want to talk a little bit about those rules for our listeners, especially beneficiaries who may not realize they can benefit without actively farming.
Yeah, it kind of goes to, I guess we touched on it a bit earlier. It's quite common that a lot of individuals don't think that they get their capital gains exemption because they didn't actively farm it. And it flows straight down in a linear fashion. And so, if your grandparents actively farmed it, you will likely have your capital gains exemption. Obviously, each circumstance is slightly different. But the common misconception is that if I rented the land out, I've lost that capital gains exemption. And as I mentioned earlier, though, it is affected if that chain is broken. And for example, if daughter is on title and then transfers it to her sister, because that's going sideways, it has to go straight down. Okay. And I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
No, it's I think previous podcast, Bridget.
We covered that one.
Kind of covered it. Yeah, no, but it's good you brought it up. It really is a big factor in estates. What's the net return at the end of the day, right?
Do we want to talk about selling estate land in larger assemblages versus single sales? I think we maybe have covered it a bit on this podcast already. Is there anything else?
I think the same applies there. The bigger assemblage, further people have come further for it. They're not going to come 10 miles for one quarter. 20 miles away, they'll come 20 miles for 15 quarters. And we mentioned the old deal about, 5 miles, there's 300 quarters within the radius, and 10 miles, there's 1,200 quarters. You start quadrupling your buyer and buyer group, and it's a game changer for value, right? It's you can get a big lift. So again, that's packaging. The more, the better. You're going to net. They're all going to get a lift, right?
And something I've seen too is perhaps dad has passed away. Mom is still alive, but is looking to sell a lot of the land off, staying on the home quarter. And they want to sell off some quarters and not everything. And while I acknowledge that it's a huge decision and that sometimes they just want to hold a quarter in the hopes of one day or something, that really needs to be looked at. And it might almost be better to wait until you sell everything. Not in one parcel, packaged the way we would with potentially on block, but just as Roy mentioned, you will get a lot more interested parties traveling for multiple quarters. So you will really adversely affect the value of your land if you start selling off one quarter at a time and try to hang on to some. Yeah. While I understand the reasoning behind it, it's good to also point out to them, that, like I mentioned, you will receive probably a lower price for your land.
Okay. Alle, how important is it to manage the complexities of different tax rules for each beneficiary? And do you have any examples of where there's tailored strategies and how they've benefited?
Just the one, that comes to my mind is when you mentioned earlier that some beneficiaries might live in Europe. Some are actively farming, some aren't. And so it's looking at each of their their situations and figuring out, okay, do you get your capital gains exemption? What applies here, basically, because each situation is so unique.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess, definitely because we're not realtors or auctioneers, because we're a law firm, there's so many different layers there. The realtors, again, haven't totally figured out what we do. But on that question there, if you're a non-resident, there's withholding tax. And, there's hundreds of those minefields out there, right? And so there's a mandatory withholding tax for CRA for a non-resident, like Ellie talked about if they're in Europe. And we then, as a law firm, have to hold that money in trust. And we sometimes would deal with the estate lawyer or lawyer for that beneficiary. But, sometimes, of course, the beneficiary's own lawyer will be different than the estate lawyer. But it's things like that, again, you just know where you just have been there, and it's like, hey, we've got an amazing team of paralegals, lawyers, accountants, Mike Reeve, videographer, yourself, Devon, a part of the team. It's a key there is just knowing those pitfalls, and it's just as soon as we know there's a non-resident, it's like, hey, make sure closing, and it'll go to our paralegals, make sure closing that withholding tax we deal with for a clearance certificate. So that's just one of many examples that we become a part of the whole process there, yeah.
Alle, maybe you already answered this, but how do you deal with conflicting perceptions about land value amongst the beneficiaries? I know you said you kind of act as like a family therapist in some scenarios there, but the other part of that too I wanted to ask is how does the executor protect themselves in that scenario when there's conflicting perceptions of land value?
I think our first is as Roy mentioned, we're honest. We're not out there to tell them what their land is worth, but we will show them, it might be different than the appraisal for these reasons. Let's start your land here and see where it will go. And at the end of the day, with our world-class marketing, drilling down, getting everyone to the table on sale day, our packaging, the beneficiaries really can't go back on the executor and say you didn't get fair market value. That would be a very difficult argument. And so that alleviates the stress off of the executor. And I think just pointing out the beneficiaries are often removed from the land and so just don't understand some things about it. And so that's where we're there to walk the walk with them, show them, what we know, where we would start at for what reasons, and really give them peace of mind. We'll work with them until they are in agreement with where we should start and, the reasons behind it.
So we've talked about the importance of marketing and doing that in a way that's, beyond just the regional approach and packaging and parceling and all of that. But are there any legal considerations when marketing estate land to out of region or international buyers?
For sure. British Columbia is the only province, and there is exceptions there too for land that's close to an urban sector and that. But generally they allow foreign buyers, whereas Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba have restrictions. And you'll see that why, up the Alaska Highway north of Fort St. John, BC and that, you see a lot of German, Swiss and that, buying ranches and that. Even in Vanderhoof area, but for sure. And so it's a factor in where we market. Basically, buyers are instructed, they bid our offer. So the executor doesn't have to deal with offers. The executor doesn't have to look at offers and look at terms. We set the terms, so from that point of view, they're basically advised to get legal advice, whether they're on side with foreign ownership. We've given notice. We don't have to drill down, beyond that on the offer type deal. But our goal is to protect the estate too, that they don't have to give some back. So everything's flushed out. Our paralegals will drill down with the oil companies on SLR. We just don't say, go clean out mom's drawer and kind of see what they were paying. Maybe the oil company comes and tells us, we give notice last year we were going to abandon that well. And so we go directly to the oil company. It's direct drive, flush it out. So yeah, when it's done, we want them to be able to go spend their money and not get a letter from a law firm from the purchaser a year later as to some sort of liability, right?
And a lot of times too, it is just educating the beneficiaries on who the potential buyers might be. You know, we had a ranch last year that was an estate sale and it was in BC. And so we advised them we can market internationally. You know, we're not regional. We will go out and find your buyer. These are the reasons that we'll go in these areas. And it's just a lot more tailored marketing to that situation. It's not a one size fits all approach. You know, we tailor absolutely everything to the situation of the individuals, and it just maximizes value for them at the end of the day.
Would you guys say that traditional estate sales by tender can often attract bottom feeders? Is that something that is a concern for the executors and for the beneficiaries? And how does CLH's platform sort of avoid that?
Yeah, totally. It's kind of like a foreclosure sale. Often people see them as estate sales.
Right, yeah.
You know, and you have more common in the U.S., I think, but they have these estate houses, like basically stores where it's kind of treated as like a discount. And so historically, I think there is a misnomer that in estate sale there's a buy. You know, we don't market our estate sales any different than any other sale. We spend the money on it, do world-class marketing. Price discovery is a big deal. I think historically, estate sales did end up selling below market because they were sold over the kitchen table.
Right.
And it was kind of like, you know, maybe you're dealing with, again, the tenant or a friend you knew, and you really don't know what the land's worth and don't know what the art's worth because it's not easy to ascertain. And you sold the art without putting it through an art auction, right? So I think, has there been a lot of probably land sold in the past at less than fair market value? We see it. You know, we search titles, and you'll see transactions that, wow, that appears to be, you know, a lot less than what we would expect, right?
But for example, a lot of times they don't even know. Like when Roy was talking about the beneficiaries who come, you know, to the area that their land is in and knock on doors for a tenant, if they would have got a offer that day from someone willing to buy it, they might have taken it because they thought the land might be hard to sell, when in reality it's in a highly fertile area with a lot of competitive farmers around, but they just don't know. And so that's where, you know, we really guide them through that. Also on the topic that you mentioned of tender, and I know we've mentioned this in previous podcasts, but again, just no one will trust tender. And a lot of individuals don't even go get financing because they see it as just a waste of their time, or they're a price setter, and the executor or beneficiaries already have an idea of who they'll sell to, maybe the tenant, for example, in the end. And so why am I going to waste my time at my bank getting my ducks in a row when they've already chosen in the end? So is that true price discovery? Absolutely not. You know, we've had someone say tendering to a law firm is like playing darts blindfolded with one dart, and it really is.
Yeah. Okay, before we wrap up here, just a couple quick questions. What would you say for both of you is the biggest challenge facing estate land sales today?
I would say, you know, manage expectations of everybody. It's diverse. And, you know, once they realize that this is the way to sell, maximize, I think they almost become more cohesive as a family unit, like Alle kind of talked about. And it's like, okay, this does work, and I'm gonna trust the market, and the buyer's gonna set the price in the end.
I agree. Managing expectations, 100%. Managing family dynamics, but it's something that we like to see at the end of the day that often it does repair itself because we just eliminate any possibility for conflict, and you know, we put that on ourselves. We'll deal with it, and you guys just you know, sit back and we'll help guide the bus type thing.
All right, guys. Well, I think that's all I have for you for today. Before we sign off, are there any parting words from either of you?
No, that's it. Thanks, Devon.
Thanks, Roy.
I would just say we love to talk farmland, and if you are in the situation of selling estate land, you're feeling overwhelmed, give us a call. You're not going to get a bill for the half-hour phone call. You know, we value those conversations, and we genuinely want to help everyone exit in a way that is stress-free and an enjoyable experience at the end of the day.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, Alle. Okay, well, that's going to do it for another edition of the Farmland Exchange Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. We appreciate the support. If you haven't already, please take a moment to subscribe on your preferred podcast platform and leave a 5-star review. It helps our content get found, and other listeners who may benefit from the information will find it easier. If you want to get in touch with us, please do. As Alle just mentioned, we love to talk farmland, and we want to help more people in similar situations. Send us an email, info@CLHbid.com. Or send us or give us a phone call, 866-263-7480. Follow us on social media. And that is going to be it for another edition. Thank you for tuning in. I hope it's been a positive exchange for you.